After 9 years, this NDP Liberal Prime Minister is not worth the hunger or the homelessness. The Calgary Hill reports of a single mother struggling to feed her family. Edith said, "I pay all of the important things first: mortgage, utilities, insurance, condo fees, and then feed the kids. If I have anything left over, they can do activities." She has resorted to feeding her family at the community kitchen. Mr. Speaker, far too many Canadians are in this sad reality. When will this government axe the carbon tax, give Canadians a break, and allow families like Edith to actually feed their families?
Hear, hear. The Honourable Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable colleague for the question, and I take his concerns as being sincere, but it's ironic that he puts his question on the floor of the House of Commons just hours after a debate on his leader's bill, which proposes to cut many of the supports that will help people like Edith. They put forward measures that are going to increase taxes on home construction. Their plan includes billions of dollars in cuts to support communities that are dealing with homelessness. They plan to cut the very funds that build affordable housing opportunities for families in need. Mr. Speaker, the government will continue to make the investments that will support vulnerable people in their time of need. I invite the Conservatives to join us.
Yes. The Honourable Member from Edmonton, Mill Woods.
Mr. Speaker, it's actually their failed policies that doubled the cost of housing. We would cut carbon tax and allow families like Edith to actually afford to pay for groceries. And after 9 years, this NDP Liberal Prime Minister is not worth the hunger or the homelessness. And according to the Salvation Army, 26% of Canadians are skipping or reducing their meals because they can't afford to buy groceries, and 1 in 4 Canadians are skipping meals so they can afford for their children to have food. Their out-of-control spending and the carbon tax are driving Canadians into poverty. When will they cut the carbon tax and give Canadians a break?
The Honourable Minister for Housing, Communities and Infrastructure.
Mr. Speaker, it is disingenuous in the extreme for the honourable colleague to argue that the very measures that put more money in the pockets of vulnerable people are driving the concerns that they are experiencing now. Yet at the same time, he's putting forward a plan, standing behind his leader, who wants to make sure that we cut programs that are building affordable housing, to cut funding that's going to cities, to cut programs that are supporting vulnerable families, whether that's programs to provide affordable childcare, whether that's programs to provide dental care, whether that's programs to provide essential medicines to people in need. Mr. Speaker, it takes investments to support the vulnerable Canadians that live in our communities. We're going to make them.
The Honourable Member from Niagara Falls.
After 9 years of this NDP Liberal government, Canadians are hungry and homeless. 2 million Canadians are now visiting food banks each month, and the Salvation Army just reported 1 in 4 Canadians have skipped or reduced the size of at least one meal because they cannot afford to buy groceries. In Niagara Falls, Project Share served more than 13,000 people last year, or 1 in 7 residents. Instead of piling on more taxes and making life more expensive, when will this NDP Liberal government axe the tax to provide the relief struggling Canadians so badly need?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Well, of course, 10 years ago, when the party opposite was in power, there were over 2 million more people in poverty. So it's a little bit difficult to take their protestations when they had the opportunity and they didn't talk about these issues. But I have a direct question for the Conservatives. When you're dealing with a senior, like a senior who this week will for the first time in 41 years get dentures in their mouth, a senior who has had plastic plates, that's all they have left to crush food in their mouth, I have a very simple question. Do they believe that senior should get dentures, and will they support making sure that she does?
The reason why that seniors like that is because you tax the shit out of them and they can't afford
The Honourable
anything.
Member for Rosemont-La Petite-Patrie. It's picnic and barbecue season, and people are wondering what they're going to be able to buy to eat. While Quebecers are making sacrifices, CEOs are rubbing their hands, and money keeps pouring in, and they're laughing because they know the Liberals won't make them pay their fair share. And the Conservatives, forget it, they'd never touch their donors' profits. Will the Liberals finally admit what everyone already knows? As long as they're around, there won't be a break for people who can't afford to buy groceries. The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker.
Oh, not her again.
Our government has a plan, an economic plan for fairness for all generations. We have a plan for fairness with respect to taxes. And that is why our government is showing with our plan that the wealthiest have to pay their fair share. And with this revenue, our government will help Quebecers in terms of dental care and help children across the country.
The honourable member from Victoria.
Mr. Speaker, a recent report outlines the devastating impacts of the climate crisis over the next decade. We can expect ecosystems collapsing, overwhelmed, and a scarcity of vital resources. And in the face of this, the Liberals...
The honourable member from Victoria, her microphones were working at the time that she started her question. I invite her to start from the top.
Oh, no.
Mr. Speaker, a recent report outlines the devastating impacts of the climate crisis over the next decade. We can expect ecosystems collapsing, our emergency responses overwhelmed, and a scarcity of vital resources. And in the face of this, the Liberals keep breaking their climate promises. In fact, they're still allowing big polluters to increase their emissions. And the Conservatives can't even agree if climate change is real. The Prime Minister is meeting with his youth council. Is he going to be honest about how he is fueling the climate crisis and endangering their future?
This chick is wild.
The Honourable Minister of the Environment and Climate Change.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to correct my honourable colleague. Since before the pandemic, our emissions have gone down in Canada, and we have one of the best performance of all G7 countries when it comes to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions since 2019. But I would agree with her. More needs to be done, which is why we have put together the first ever national adaptation strategy, working with provinces, territory, Indigenous nation, municipalities to ensure that we are better prepared to help Canadians and their communities face the impacts of climate change, something, unfortunately, that the Conservative Party of Canada can't even come to mention.
The honourable member from Don Valley East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our government presented Canadians with a housing plan that will increase the housing supply across the country. A core measure of the plan is the removal of GST off of new apartments, student housing, and cooperatives. Earlier today, the House debated the Conservative leader's housing plan, Bill C-356. Mr. Speaker, this bill would actually put the tax back on the construction of middle-class apartments. Can the Minister of Housing tell Canadians where the government stands on the Conservative leader's plan to reimpose a rent tax on middle-class apartments? Thank you, Mr.
The Honourable Minister for Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable colleague for the question. I can just imagine the setting when the leader of the Conservatives sat down with the napkin he wrote his housing plan upon and thought, what can I do to address the housing crisis? Idea one, raise taxes on home construction. You can't make this stuff up, Mr. Speaker, but wait, that's not all. They also plan to cut funding for affordable housing. They also plan to cut funding for cities that build more housing, and they plan to cut the measures that are going to make it easier for young people to buy their first home. When you look at the Conservative leader's private member's bill, you won't find a housing plan. You'll find a disaster.
You've made a disaster of this country.
The honourable member from Kenora.
After 9 years, this NDP Liberal Prime Minister is not worth the hunger and homelessness. Mr. Speaker, a recent CBC report highlighted the reality for people living in Thunder Bay. There, neighbours are having to share groceries and other essentials just to be able to get by. Now, realizing that Canadians are struggling and that their plan has received a failing grade from the Poverty Report Card, will this Prime Minister finally axe the carbon tax and stop his inflationary spending to bring home lower prices for all Canadians?
The Honourable Minister for Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
Mr. Speaker, I have a hard time accepting this question from a member who I respect and believe is here for the right reasons when he puts the question in a frame of homelessness, but is willing to stand behind his leader when he proposes to cut funding that serve homeless Canadians across this country. Mr. Speaker, I never hear ideas from the Conservatives about making more investments to support vulnerable people. I never hear ideas from the Conservatives that will actually result in more homes being built. It's cut, cut, cut every step of the way. They do not want to put measures in place that will help vulnerable Canadians. We absolutely will.
I'm going to invite all members, please. It's been a really pretty good question period to listen to the questions and to listen to the answers, and to please listen, lend their attention to the honourable member from Kenora.
Mr. Speaker, the minister can try to deflect and deny as much as he wants, but the fact of the matter is, after 9 years, it's his government's policies that have caused hunger and homelessness to rise. Now, 1 in 4 Canadians are struggling to put food on the table. People are spending over 30% of their incomes on housing alone, Mr. Speaker. This is the NDP Liberal plan in action. How can they possibly believe that their plan is working?
The Honourable Minister for Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
Mr. Speaker, he wants to talk about our policies on affordability. How about the Canada Child Benefit that puts more money in the pockets of 9 out of 10 Canadian families and stop sending childcare checks to millionaires? Yet his party voted against it. Let's look at the change that restored the age of retirement to 65 from 67. His party voted against it. Let's look at the guaranteed income supplement for low-income single seniors increasing by up to $947. His party voted against it. Let's look at the student loan forgiveness measures for healthcare professionals that work in communities like mine. Their party votes against it. Every time they have a chance to help someone, they say no.
Hey, calm down, Mr. Fraser. The worst housing
the honourable
minister
member
ever.
from Costa Bay Central, Notre Dame.
Mr. Speaker, this NDP Liberal government is receiving a failing grade in Newfoundland and Labrador. Back home, according to Food Banks Canada and its annual poverty report card, almost half are paying more than 30% of their earnings to house themselves. 40% are worried about feeding themselves. Mr. Speaker, after 9 years, this NDP Liberal Prime Minister is not worth the hunger and the homelessness. So will he listen to the premiers who begged him to axe the tax so that people can feed and house themselves?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, if my honourable colleague opposite really wanted to do something for Newfoundlanders and Labradorians and all Atlantic Canadians, he'd vote to pass the fall economic statement, because that would mean $1,430 to families of 4 in his riding. That means $2,160 to family of 4 in Alberta, $1,805 to families in Saskatchewan, $1,440 to families in Manitoba, $1,300 to families in Ontario, $912 to families in New Brunswick. That's how we help Canadians.
The honourable member from Costa Bay Central, Notre Dame.
Mr. Speaker, I find that a bit rich coming from my colleague from Long Range Mountains, who voted against Bill C-251, against the sealing industry, against the fishing industry, against the people in our very own riding, Madam Speaker, or Mr. Speaker. But you know what? Back to the matter at hand here. 45% back home have an inadequate standard of living. 35% have a severely inadequate standard of living. 26% are experiencing food insecurity. So after 9 years, while this NDP Liberal Prime Minister, who's not worth the hunger and not worth the homelessness, axe the tax and listen to the premiers of back home.
The Honourable Minister for Rural Economic Development and for COA.
Mr. Speaker, I'll tell you what we do on this side of the House. On this side of the House, we support communities. We support businesses. So I'd love to know the member opposite's comment to the 181 projects that COA has funded in his riding that supported 64 businesses, 43 not-for-profit organizations, and he voted against every single one of those, Mr. Speaker. That's supporting businesses. That's supporting communities. That's what we do, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for La Pointe de Lille. While the Liberals were making headlines with their contradictions about French, last week the report from Quebec's Office de langue française went unnoticed. Yet, guess which sector ranks first among Quebec's workplaces where it's hardest to work in French most of the time? The federal government. Yes, that's right. The federal government is Quebec's worst sector when it comes to Quebecers' right to work in their own language. Will the Liberals finally stop encouraging the decline of French in Quebec?
See, they want to promote French, but they don't promote
President
English
of the Treasury
Quebec.
Board, Mr. Speaker.
Like, everything's in French.
Our
Even if
two
you get a
official
parking ticket, it's
languages
in French. You
are
can't
a
even read
wealth for all Canadians, and we will continue to protect both official languages every time, every month, every year, Mr. Speaker. We have done so since 2015. Our government has been committed to promote both in French, English, and after 10 years of investments, the opposition, well, what are we going to do? We're going to continue to protect both official languages always, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for La Pointe-à-l'Île. The federal government is the worst machine for anglicizing workers, according to Quebec's OLF, and the impact is catastrophic. Take Gatineau, where the federal government is the largest employer. Between 2016 and 2021, the percentage of people working mainly in French fell from 77% to 62%. That's a 17% drop in just 4 years. Quebec's fourth largest city is rapidly becoming anglicized with the complicity of the Liberals. I repeat my question, will the Liberals finally stop encouraging the decline of French in Quebec? The Honourable Government House Leader. Mr. Speaker, thank you. My Honourable Bloc colleague has admitted something. He has admitted saying that he hates the fact that Quebecers are working right now and contributing to support the best country in the world, Canada, from offices that are located on the Quebec side of the river and on the Ontario side of the river. And Quebecers are also strongly contributing to make sure that we have a bilingual country that respects its official languages and helps to grow Canada. The Honourable Member for Bellechasse, Les-Chemin-Lévis. Mr. Speaker, after 9 years, this Liberal Bloc government isn't worth the cost. The Bloc voted for $500 billion in appropriations because it wants to keep the Liberal government in power. Quebecers are sleeping in dumpsters, homeless, and hungry. And the Bloc is supporting the Liberals who are responsible for this suffering. Can this Liberal Bloc Prime Minister stop his out-of-control spending, allow Quebecers to live in dignity? The Honourable Minister of Public Services. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to remind my colleague that her leader created 6 affording housing units.
That's all this guy ever says. I'm surprised he said something different earlier.
Many in her writing in recent months opened. Does she agree with the leader that the dental health program doesn't exist? While in her writing, there are 9,000 seniors that have signed up for this in her writing and have been able to receive dental care for the first time in their lives. They're saying this regime doesn't exist. The Honourable Member for Bellechasse, Les-Chemin-Lévis. After 9 years of this Liberal Bloc Prime Minister, Quebecers are living in unbearable misery because of this housing and homelessness crisis. The more the Bloc-supported government spends, the more the Quebec nation loses. The Bloc is keeping this Prime Minister in power. Can they start thinking of Quebecers instead of supporting the misery imposed on them by this Prime Minister? The Honourable Minister.
He's going to say this.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My colleague is saying that people are having a hard time, but people in my region are also having a hard time when they try to understand that the Conservatives are saying that the dental health care system doesn't exist. But in her writing, there are 9,000 seniors that have signed up. Thousands of people in Quebec have been able to access dental care for the first time. You get even more confused when you hear these figures when the leader of the Conservatives is saying that this dental care system doesn't exist. The Honourable Member for Lévis-Lotbinière. Mr. Speaker, after 9 years of this Liberal Bloc Prime Minister, it's too much to take. The result, increased homelessness and empty stomachs. The Bloc, by supporting all the $500 billion budget appropriations, has amplified inflation, housing costs, energy costs, grocery costs, the cost of bureaucracy, and centralizing power. Mr. Speaker, going hungry and sleeping on a park bench has become the daily life for too many people. Quebecers are having a hard time, and is it the best the Bloc and the Liberals have to offer Quebecers? The Honourable Minister. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. When I see the Conservatives across the way with their hands on their hearts, Mr. Speaker, talking about affordability, what hypocrisy, Mr. Speaker. They have voted against the dental care program. They're against the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. They are ready to attack reproductive rights of women, Mr. Speaker, and deprive diabetics of medication. It is